As the cabin doors of Flight 327 closed, flight attendant Caroline Walker was ready for another smooth journey, or so she thought. When a poised black family stepped into first class, her subtle decision to question their place seemed minor at first. But that choice would ripple far beyond the flight, leading to a shocking discovery. These passengers didn't just belong. They owned the airline. What happens next will challenge everything you think about privilege, power, and redemption. Enjoy stories with jaw-dropping twists and powerful lessons? Don't wait. Hit subscribe now and stay tuned for more thought-provoking tales. Caroline Walker's heels clicked sharply against the polished tiles of the boarding gate at Aerolux Airlines Flight 715. The sound carried a quiet authority, a reminder of her place in this meticulously curated world of luxury. With 15 years of service behind her, she prided herself on reading people at a glance. Her navy uniform was crisp, her name badge gleaming under the soft overhead lights. For Caroline, Aerolux Airlines wasn't just a job. It was an extension of her identity. This was where exclusivity reigned, where first-class passengers exuded refinement, and where she ensured every detail reflected the brand's prestige. She took her role seriously, and she expected the same standard from the passengers she served. Her eyes swept the line forming at the gate. Most passengers fit the profile: tailored suits, designer luggage, a casual confidence that came with knowing you belonged. But then, her gaze landed on them. The Reynolds family stood out, though not in the way Caroline typically noticed. Ethan Reynolds, tall and composed, wore a modest navy suit that fit well but lacked the flair of custom tailoring. Beside him, Natalie Reynolds looked serene in a simple yet elegant dress, her curly hair loosely tied back. Their children, Liam and Sophia, were clutching their parents' hands, their small backpacks neatly slung over their shoulders. Caroline's brow furrowed slightly as her practiced instincts kicked in. Something about them felt off. Not because of their clothes, they were neat, respectable, but because they didn't carry the effortless air of wealth she had come to expect. It was subtle, like a faint note out of tune in an otherwise perfect symphony. "Good evening," Caroline said as they stepped forward. Her smile was polished, but her voice carried an almost imperceptible coolness. She quickly scanned their boarding passes, and the words first class jumped out at her. Her fingers hesitated slightly, but she recovered with the poise of a seasoned professional. "Welcome aboard," she said. Her tone was warm, but her eyes darted briefly to Ethan's watch, a functional timepiece, not the gleam of a Rolex, and then to Natalie's understated handbag. "One moment, please," she added. "I need to verify something." Ethan's calm expression didn't falter, but his voice carried a quiet edge. "Is there a problem with our tickets?" Caroline's smile widened slightly, a reflex more than reassurance. "Oh no, not at all. Just a routine check." She stepped aside and approached a supervisor under the guise of confirming their reservation. She didn't need to. The system had already validated their tickets. Still, something gnawed at her, a whispering doubt she couldn't articulate. As she turned back, she found Ethan watching her with a steady gaze. He wasn't angry or impatient, but there was a quiet confidence in his demeanor that unsettled her. Beside him, Natalie's lips curved into a polite but unreadable smile, one hand resting lightly on her daughter Sophia's shoulder. Liam was peering curiously at the boarding gate, oblivious to the subtle tension. Caroline handed back their tickets. "Everything checks out," she said. "Enjoy your flight." But instead of leading them to the spacious front row seats of the first-class cabin, Caroline directed them to the last row, a section closer to the economy divider, far from the wide windows that offered the best views. It was a small decision, almost insignificant to an outsider. But to Caroline, it felt like putting things back in their proper order. "Thank you," Ethan said simply, his tone measured but firm. Natalie nodded graciously, her smile unwavering. They moved to their seats without complaint, settling the children in with quiet efficiency. As Sophia tugged her activity book from her bag, Natalie smoothed her hair with a practiced gesture. To any observer, they seemed like a family preparing for a pleasant journey. But Caroline couldn't shake the feeling that they were more composed than they should have been. As the rest of the passengers boarded, Caroline's attention kept drifting back to the Reynolds family. She told herself she was being vigilant, a habit ingrained by years of experience. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Something about them didn't sit right, and the more she thought about it, the more it gnawed at her. "You're staring," a voice said beside her. Caroline turned to see Emma Brooks, a junior flight attendant, holding a tray of champagne glasses. Emma's expression was curious but amused. "Something wrong?" "Nothing," Caroline said quickly, her tone sharper than intended. She glanced toward the Reynolds family again. "Just keeping an eye on things." Emma followed her gaze. "Oh, them? They seem sweet. The kids are adorable." Caroline didn't respond. Instead, she turned back to arranging menus, her movements precise and controlled. She couldn't put her finger on it, but something about that family's calmness felt like a quiet defiance, as though they were aware of her thoughts and had chosen to rise above them. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, the first-class cabin had settled into its usual rhythm. Passengers reclined in their luxurious seats, soft classical music played through hidden speakers, and the faint clink of champagne glasses filled the air. Caroline moved through the aisles with practiced grace, attending to requests with her usual efficiency. But every time she passed the Reynolds family, her unease grew. Ethan was reading a book, his posture relaxed but upright. Natalie was helping Sophia color in her activity book while Liam leaned against the window, his face pressed to the glass as he admired the view. There was nothing disruptive about them. If anything, they were quieter and more composed than most of the first-class passengers Caroline had served. "Everything okay, Caroline?" Emma asked again, her voice softer this time. Caroline hesitated, her hand tightening slightly on the edge of her serving tray. "Fine," she said. But it wasn't fine. Her usual sense of control felt shaky, as though she were balancing on uneven ground. A few rows ahead, Michael Carter, a middle-aged man in a sharp suit, had been observing the exchange silently. His keen eyes caught the way Caroline's demeanor shifted whenever she approached the Reynolds family. He noticed the subtle delay in their service, the stiffness in Caroline's smile. For now, he said nothing, but his raised eyebrow and slight frown suggested that he, too, was taking notes. The first-class cabin of Aerolux Airlines Flight 715 exuded quiet opulence. Soft golden lighting bathed the spacious seats, the faint clink of champagne glasses mingling with murmurs of polite conversation. Every detail, from the rich walnut finishes to the plush leather seats, was designed to project exclusivity, a world apart from the bustling economy cabin just a divider away. For Caroline Walker, this setting was her domain, a place where she prided herself on maintaining order and elegance. Yet tonight, something felt off. Her gaze drifted, almost involuntarily, toward the Reynolds family, seated in the last row of first class. The Reynolds row lacked the prestige of the front seats, with their panoramic windows and heightened privacy. Instead, their view faced the divider separating first class from economy, a subtle but undeniable reminder of where they stood. Ethan Reynolds, tall and composed, read a book with an air of quiet focus. Beside him, Natalie Reynolds exuded grace as she leaned toward her daughter Sophia, who was absorbed in coloring her activity book. Their son Liam stared out the small window, his wide eyes reflecting the wonder of the sky beyond. Caroline had positioned them there deliberately, though she wouldn't admit it even to herself. She told herself it was practical, a way to ensure the best seats were reserved for passengers who, in her mind, more clearly belonged. But the family's calmness was disarming. They hadn't complained, hadn't demanded better treatment, yet their presence unsettled her. She couldn't stop the nagging feeling that their quiet composure carried a subtle defiance, one she didn't know how to confront. From a few rows ahead, Michael Carter, a sharply dressed man with salt and pepper hair, had been watching. His tailored suit and polished demeanor marked him as a seasoned first-class traveler. He sipped his whiskey slowly, his discerning eyes catching every nuance of Caroline's interactions. He noticed how her smile dimmed ever so slightly as she passed the Reynolds row. He saw how their menus had been delivered later than the others, their service just a beat behind the rest of the cabin. Michael didn't make a habit of getting involved, but something about the situation didn't sit right with him. In the galley, Caroline adjusted the tray of champagne flutes in front of her, her movements brisk and deliberate. She sensed eyes on her. Michael's steady gaze, perhaps, or the quiet scrutiny of the Reynolds family. It made her feel exposed in a way she hadn't felt in years. "You're still watching them, aren't you?" Emma Brooks, a junior flight attendant, asked as she arranged hors d'oeuvres nearby. Her tone was light, but her words carried an edge of curiosity. Caroline glanced at her sharply. "I'm not watching anyone," she said, a little too quickly. She adjusted the tray again, as if the task required her full attention. Emma smirked. "Sure you're not. But honestly, they seem like a nice family. Polite, quiet. The kids are adorable." "They're different," Caroline muttered, barely audible. Emma raised an eyebrow. "Different? Or you think they don't belong?" Caroline froze for a moment, her fingers tightening around the edge of the tray. "That's not what I said," she replied, her voice sharper now. Emma studied her for a beat, then shrugged. "People surprise you, you know? Sometimes the ones you least expect end up teaching you something." Caroline said nothing, her jaw tightening as she turned back to her work. As the flight progressed, the tension simmered beneath the cabin's polished surface. The first-class passengers enjoyed their multi-course dinner, each dish paired with fine wines. Caroline moved through the aisles with practiced grace, her tray laden with plates of seared salmon and filet mignon. When she reached the Reynolds family's row, their menus still sat unopened on their tray tables. Natalie looked up, her gaze calm but steady. "May we order now?" she asked, her tone polite yet firm, leaving no room for dismissal. Caroline hesitated for the briefest moment before plastering on her professional smile. "Of course," she said, setting the menus down with just a touch too much force. "What can I get for you?" As Natalie and Ethan placed their orders, Caroline jotted them down quickly, avoiding their eyes. Her movements felt mechanical, her usual confidence eroding under the weight of their composed presence. Michael Carter had been watching. When Caroline walked away, he set his whiskey glass down and flagged down Emma, who was passing by with a tray of dessert wines. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but firm. "Can you tell me why the family in the last row of first class was served so late? It's hard not to notice." Emma's eyes widened slightly. She glanced toward Caroline, who was only a few feet away, then back at Michael. "I'm not sure," she said, her voice hesitant. Caroline stepped forward before Emma could say more. Her smile was tight, her voice carefully measured. "I assure you, sir, everything is under control." Michael tilted his head, his expression sharp but calm. "Under control?" he repeated, his tone laced with quiet authority. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like there's a deliberate effort to treat them differently. Would you say that's reflective of Aerolux standards?" The question hung in the air, cutting through the cabin's polished atmosphere like a knife. Caroline's cheeks flushed, but her professional mask didn't slip. "I'm sorry if it appeared that way, sir," she said smoothly. "That was not the intention." Michael studied her for a long moment, his gaze unyielding. Then, with a small shake of his head, he turned back to his meal, leaving Caroline feeling more exposed than she had in years. As the dinner service wound down, the cabin grew quieter. Most passengers had reclined their seats, sipping coffee or flipping through in-flight movies. But in the Reynolds family's row, the tension lingered. Ethan leaned slightly toward Natalie, his voice low. "They're watching us," he said. Natalie glanced at him, her expression calm but knowing. "Let them," she replied softly. Her hand rested lightly on Sophia's shoulder, a small but protective gesture. "We've dealt with worse." Ethan nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. His children were blissfully unaware, their innocence a quiet shield against the subtle hostility around them. But for Ethan and Natalie, every delay, every sidelong glance, carried a weight they were all too familiar with. From the galley, Caroline watched them, her tray forgotten. A flicker of doubt crept into her mind, unsettling and persistent. Had she misjudged them? And if so, what did that say about her? The gentle hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane began its descent into Paris. The first-class cabin was quiet now, most passengers reclining under cashmere blankets, lulled by the dimmed lighting and the soothing whispers of luxury. But Caroline Walker felt none of that calm. She stood in the galley, her polished heels planted firmly on the floor, as if she could anchor herself against the growing unease curling in her chest. Her fingers traced the edge of the counter, her gaze darting toward the Reynolds family, seated at the last row of first class. Ethan Reynolds had set his book aside and was scrolling through his phone, his face impassive but focused. Natalie Reynolds, always poised, adjusted Sophia's blanket while whispering something soft to Liam, who was still staring out the window with wide-eyed wonder. They were the picture of composure, as they had been throughout the flight, and that composure unnerved Caroline more than any raised voice or sharp retort ever could. Every gesture, every calm look felt like a quiet rebuke. And while Caroline had dismissed her instincts earlier, something about the family lingered in her thoughts. Perhaps it was Michael Carter's pointed question that had forced her to confront her actions. Or maybe it was the gnawing realization that she had spent the entire flight categorizing the Reynolds family into a narrative they clearly didn't belong to. Caroline. Emma Brooks appeared beside her, snapping her back to the present. You've been staring at them all flight. What's going on? Caroline hesitated, trying to gather her thoughts. Nothing, she said sharply, her voice more defensive than she intended. Just making sure everything's in order. Emma raised an eyebrow. Sure, she said, drawing the word out. But if you ask me, they seem fine. Like, way calmer than most of the people up here. Caroline didn't answer. Instead, she adjusted her uniform and smoothed the stray wisps of hair from her bun. I'm going to check on the other passengers, she muttered, walking away before Emma could press further. The plane touched down smoothly on the tarmac, and a ripple of polite applause broke out in the first-class cabin. Caroline busied herself with post-landing tasks, collecting blankets and ensuring the seating area was in order. She clung to these tasks, each one a small anchor against the rising tide of unease. Caroline, a voice called softly from the front of the cabin. She looked up to see Captain Richard Scott, the seasoned and composed pilot, standing at the cockpit door. His expression was neutral, but there was something about the way he gestured for her to follow that sent a chill down her spine. She followed him into the cockpit, where the hum of the plane's systems filled the small, confined space. Captain Scott gestured for her to take a seat in the jump seat, while the co-pilot quietly finished his landing checklist. What's this about? Caroline asked, forcing her voice to stay steady. Scott folded his hands on the console in front of him, his blue eyes sharp but calm. We received a message from corporate during the flight, he said, his tone measured. It concerns two of your passengers, Ethan and Natalie Reynolds. Caroline froze, the words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Corporate, she echoed, her throat tightening. They're not just passengers, Scott continued. They're the new majority shareholders of Aerolux Airlines. Caroline's breath caught. Shareholders. The weight of the word seemed to press against her chest. Majority shareholders? She repeated, barely above a whisper. Scott nodded. They acquired a significant stake in the company recently. This flight was one of their first trips incognito, to evaluate our service firsthand. Her stomach twisted. Every decision she had made during the flight, every delay, every dismissive glance, flooded back to her in excruciating detail. She thought of Natalie's composed request to order dinner and Ethan's calm silence. She thought of how she had moved their seats to the back of the first-class cabin, a decision she could no longer justify even to herself. And now, every one of those actions had been under the scrutiny of the people who owned the airline. Scott's tone softened, though his words were no less direct. They've requested to meet with you in the VIP lounge before leaving the airport. Caroline's chest tightened. A meeting? She asked, her voice trembling. With them? Scott nodded again. Yes. And Caroline, this isn't optional. Corporate has already been informed. I suggest you prepare yourself. The VIP lounge was quiet, its marble floors gleaming under the soft glow of recessed lighting. Caroline's heels clicked softly as she approached the glass doors, each step heavier than the last. Beyond the doors, she saw the Reynolds family seated in plush armchairs. Ethan's posture was relaxed, one leg crossed over the other, his hand resting lightly on the armrest. Natalie sat upright beside him, a quiet strength emanating from her every gesture. Caroline's gaze flickered to the bracelet on Natalie's wrist. It wasn't flashy or ostentatious. Instead, it was elegant and understated, its intricate goldwork hinting at generations of history and refinement. The sight of it made something in Caroline's chest tighten. It was a reminder of how deeply she had misjudged them. Not just their wealth, but their place in this world she thought she knew so well. Caroline, Captain Scott's voice interrupted her thoughts. They're expecting you. Drawing a shaky breath, Caroline straightened her uniform and stepped inside. The soft sound of her heels echoed in the spacious lounge. Ethan's sharp eyes met hers immediately, calm yet piercing. Natalie turned her gaze toward Caroline, her expression poised but unyielding. "Ms. Walker," Ethan said, his voice measured and firm. "Please have a seat." Caroline lowered herself into the chair across from them, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. Her confidence, so steady throughout her career, felt like it had evaporated under their steady gazes. "Caroline, is it?" Natalie asked, her voice smooth but tinged with quiet authority. "Yes, ma'am," Caroline replied, her voice barely audible. She forced herself to look up, meeting Natalie's calm but unwavering gaze. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the armrests. "I'd like to start by asking you a question," he said, his tone almost conversational. "Why do you think we're here?" Caroline hesitated, her mind scrambling for an answer. Finally, she stammered, I understand there were issues during the flight." Natalie tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Issues?" she repeated, her tone laced with incredulity. "Caroline, this isn't about a delayed drink order. It's about respect, or rather, the lack of it." Caroline's throat tightened. She wanted to defend herself, to explain, but no words came. Every excuse felt hollow, every justification meaningless under the weight of Natalie's calm rebuke. Ethan leaned back, his expression unreadable. "This isn't just about us," he said. "It's about the culture we're building at Aerolux. We need to ensure that every passenger feels like they belong, not just the ones who fit someone's preconceived notions." The words hit Caroline like a blow. Her silence stretched on, but the Reynolds didn't rush her. They simply waited, their composed presence magnifying the weight of her regret. The air in the VIP lounge was as still as a held breath. The soft hum of distant conversations from other corners of the room seemed to fade into nothing as Caroline Walker sat across from Ethan and Natalie Reynolds. Her hands rested in her lap, clasped tightly, her nails digging into her palms. The opulence of the room, with its marble floors and leather armchairs, felt suffocating rather than comforting. Ethan's composed posture contrasted sharply with the turmoil inside her. He leaned back in his chair, one leg crossed, his eyes sharp and calculating. Natalie's presence was no less commanding. She sat upright, her hands folded neatly in her lap, every movement deliberate, every word she had spoken during the flight replaying in Caroline's mind like an echo she couldn't silence. This wasn't a conversation. It was a reckoning. Caroline cleared her throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the hushed space. "Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I want to apologize for anything during the flight that fell short of your expectations." Ethan's lips quirked into a faint smile, devoid of warmth. "That's quite the corporate response," he said, his tone calm but cutting. "Let me ask you something, Ms. Walker, do you believe you treated us fairly during this flight?" The question hit like a sudden turbulence. Caroline's prepared lines dissolved under the weight of his steady gaze. She could deflect, try to explain away her actions, but what would be the point? Her professional facade had already cracked. "No, sir," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't believe I did." Ethan exchanged a brief glance with Natalie, who didn't react outwardly, though her gaze on Caroline seemed to intensify. "And why not?" Ethan pressed, his tone free of malice but heavy with expectation. Caroline's throat tightened. The words she had avoided thinking, let alone speaking, hung on the edge of her tongue. But there was no escaping them now. "I made assumptions," she said finally, the admission dragging out like a weight tied to her words. "I assumed you didn't belong in first class, and I let those assumptions affect how I treated you." Silence filled the space, as heavy as the truth she had just spoken. Ethan leaned back, his expression unreadable. Natalie, however, tilted her head slightly, her gaze narrowing. "Do you know how often we've heard that?" Natalie asked, her voice smooth but edged with steel. "Not in so many words, of course. It's always in the small things, the delays, the glances, the unspoken decisions. People like you deciding, consciously or not, that we don't belong." Caroline flinched. The words hit harder than any raised voice or overt accusation could have. I didn't mean to," she started, her voice faltering. Natalie raised a hand, silencing her. "Intentions don't erase the impact, Ms. Walker," she said, her tone measured but firm. "The discomfort you felt seeing us in first class? That's nothing compared to the discomfort people like us have lived with for years." Ethan added, his voice quieter but no less impactful. "We've worked hard to build a life where we don't have to justify our presence. But no matter how far we've come, moments like this remind us that the work isn't finished, not for us, and certainly not for people like you." Caroline swallowed hard. Her usual poise felt distant, unreachable. She had always believed she treated people with fairness and respect, but the Reynolds words dismantled that belief with precision. The very professionalism she prided herself on had masked a bias she couldn't deny. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice raw. "I was wrong. I judged you unfairly, and I'm sorry." Natalie's expression softened slightly, though her tone remained steady. "Sorry is a start," she said, "but it's not enough." The door to the lounge slid open quietly, and Captain Richard Scott stepped inside. His presence, a brief interruption, felt almost like a lifeline for Caroline, though his neutral expression betrayed no intention of rescuing her. "Everything satisfactory here?" he asked politely, his gaze flicking between the Reynolds and Caroline. Ethan glanced up at him. "We're in the middle of an important conversation," he replied evenly. "We won't take much longer." The captain nodded and left without another word. The soft hiss of the door closing was the only sound for a moment, and then Ethan turned his attention back to Caroline. "Ms. Walker," he said, his tone measured, "this meeting isn't about humiliating you. We're not here to demand an apology because you got caught. What we want is accountability." Caroline blinked, the weight of the words settling over her. "I understand," she said quietly. "I want to make this right." Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on the armrests. "And how do you plan to do that?" The question hung in the air like a challenge she wasn't ready to answer. Caroline's thoughts scrambled for a response, but the truth was painfully clear. She didn't know. I'm not sure," she admitted, the admission feeling like the shattering of the last protective wall she had built around herself. Natalie's voice, calm yet unyielding, broke the silence. "Acknowledging the problem is the first step. The next is deciding how to change. That's what we want to see, not words, but actions." As the conversation drew to a close, Caroline felt a strange mix of shame and clarity. The Reynolds hadn't raised their voices or made accusations. They didn't need to. Their composed presence had forced her to confront the parts of herself she had ignored for years. When Ethan and Natalie rose from their seats, Ethan extended a hand. Caroline hesitated, then took it, his grip firm but not unkind. "Good luck, Ms. Walker," he said simply. "What you do next is up to you." Natalie nodded, her gaze steady. "Change takes effort," she said. "I hope you're willing to make it." Caroline could only nod, her throat too tight to form words. She watched as the Reynolds left the lounge, their footsteps soft against the marble floor. The door slid shut behind them, leaving her alone in the quiet room. For a long moment, Caroline sat motionless, her thoughts a tangled mess of regret and determination. She had spent years convincing herself that she was above reproach, that her professionalism shielded her from bias. But the Reynolds had torn through that illusion with quiet precision. Now, she had to decide what came next. Not for her job, but for herself. Drawing a deep breath, Caroline rose from her seat. She didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, she was willing to start asking the right questions. The coffee in Caroline Walker's cup had gone cold. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the dark liquid, as if it might offer some clarity. The muted morning light streaming through the window seemed dimmer today, casting long shadows that felt as heavy as her thoughts. Her mind kept looping back to the previous night, to the Reynolds family seated across from her in the VIP lounge. Ethan's calm yet piercing gaze. Natalie's words, precise and unwavering. And the question that refused to leave her alone. How do you plan to make this right? Caroline had no answer then, and she barely had one now. Her career had been built on control, managing chaos, anticipating needs, smoothing rough edges before passengers even noticed them. But this wasn't turbulence she could navigate with efficiency or charm. This was something far more unsettling. The realization that she had been the problem. The sharp ding of her laptop snapped her out of her thoughts. She reached for it with a trembling hand, dreading what awaited her. The subject line of the email read, "Mandatory review of incident on Flight 287. Follow-up meeting required." Caroline clicked, her chest tightening as she skimmed the formal text. The Reynolds family had filed an official report, not as a punitive act but as a call for systemic change. She was to meet with human resources the next morning to address the incident. Her future with Aerolux depended on the outcome. The final line hit her hardest. "We take matters of inclusivity and fairness very seriously and expect our employees to embody these values." Caroline leaned back in her chair, the words blurring as guilt, shame, and fear churned inside her. Fairness. Inclusivity. These weren't just company buzzwords anymore. They were the standards by which she would now be judged. And for the first time in years, she wasn't sure she measured up. That night, sleep was elusive. Caroline sat in bed with her laptop, its glow the only light in her dim room. Her fingers hovered over the search bar before typing. Unconscious bias in the workplace. The results flooded in. Articles, videos, personal essays. She clicked through them, skimming at first, then slowing down as certain phrases hit close to home. One story stopped her cold, a flight attendant's account of how she had been forced to confront her own biases after a similar incident. The details differed, but the themes were hauntingly familiar. The writer didn't just apologize. She changed, through hard conversations, painful self-reflection, and a willingness to dismantle the assumptions she hadn't even realized she carried. Caroline bookmarked the page. For the first time in years, she felt the faintest flicker of something resembling hope. Not because it absolved her, but because it showed her that change, however difficult, was possible. The next morning, Caroline walked into Aerolux corporate headquarters with her head high but her stomach in knots. The polished glass walls and sleek decor felt colder than usual, like a reflection of her own fragile state. The conference room was brightly lit, its stark white table stretching between her and the two people seated across from her. Evelyn Moore, the HR manager, was known for her no-nonsense approach. Victor Tran, Aerolux chief culture officer, had a reputation for being fair but unyielding when it came to the company's values. Ms. Walker, Evelyn began, gesturing for Caroline to sit. "Thank you for coming. Let's get straight to the point." Victor leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "We've reviewed the Reynolds family's report. They've made it clear that this isn't about a single incident, it's about a culture of accountability. They've asked us to address not just what happened on Flight 287, but what it represents." Caroline nodded, her throat tight. "I understand," she said softly. Victor's gaze sharpened. "Do you?" he asked. "Because understanding isn't just acknowledging you made a mistake. It means recognizing the assumptions and biases that led to it and committing to change." Caroline hesitated, the words catching in her throat. She thought back to Natalie's calm rebuke in the lounge, the way it had cut through her defenses. She thought about Liam and Sophia, the Reynolds children, and how they might have seen her actions. Did they feel dismissed? Unwelcome? Finally, she spoke. "I do understand," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "I made assumptions about the Reynolds family, assumptions that were wrong and harmful. I know that acknowledging that isn't enough. I want to learn how to do better, not just for myself but for the company." Evelyn arched an eyebrow, but Victor nodded slightly, his expression neutral. "And how do you plan to do that?" Caroline took a deep breath. "I've started educating myself. I spent last night reading about unconscious bias and its effects. I've also signed up for a diversity and inclusion workshop. But I don't want to stop there. I want to work with Airolux to identify ways we can improve how we train staff to recognize and address these issues." For a moment, the room was silent. Then Evelyn spoke, her voice clipped but not unkind. "That's a start, Ms. Walker. But this isn't just about personal growth. It's about ensuring this company reflects the values we stand for." Victor leaned back in his chair, his tone softening slightly. "The Reynolds family didn't ask for you to be terminated. They asked for accountability. Whether or not you're part of the solution is up to you." Hours later, Caroline left the corporate building with a heavy but determined heart. Her future at Airolux wasn't guaranteed, but she had been given a chance, something she wouldn't take lightly. That night, as she sat on her balcony overlooking the city, Caroline thought of Liam and Sophia again, their small faces pressed against the plane's windows. The quiet way they had held themselves, perhaps sensing the subtle hostility in her actions. "What you do next is up to you," Ethan had said. Caroline opened her laptop and clicked on the confirmation email for the workshop she had registered for. She scrolled to the first module, her fingers trembling slightly as she hovered over the Start button. She clicked. The coffee on Caroline Walker's kitchen table had long gone cold, but she hadn't moved to replace it. Instead, she sat frozen, the soft light filtering through the window highlighting the furrow in her brow. She had replayed the meeting with the Reynolds family so many times that every word, every moment of silence, was etched into her mind. Ethan's composed challenge, "How do you plan to make this right?" Natalie's quiet rebuke, "Intentions don't erase the impact." Caroline had no answer then, and even now, she wasn't sure she had one. But what she did know was this: the person she had been, the one who dismissed the Reynolds without a second thought, was not someone she wanted to be. Later that morning, an email from Airolux Corporate arrived, its subject line stark and foreboding. "Mandatory review of incident on Flight 287. Follow-up meeting required." Her heart thudded as she opened it. The message was formal and concise. The Reynolds family had submitted an official report, not as an act of punishment, but as a call for systemic change. She was to attend a meeting with Human Resources to discuss the incident and its implications. The outcome of this meeting would determine her future with Airolux. Caroline exhaled sharply, her hands trembling as she closed her laptop. Her stomach churned as she reread the last line in her mind. "We take matters of inclusivity and fairness very seriously and expect our employees to embody these values." Fairness. Inclusivity. They were no longer abstract ideals printed on a company brochure. They were the very standards she had failed to meet. That night, unable to sleep, Caroline found herself at her kitchen table once again, her laptop glowing in the dim light. After a long hesitation, she began typing into the search bar, "unconscious bias in the workplace." Dozens of results appeared, articles, videos, and personal essays. She clicked through them, scrolling absently at first, but her attention sharpened as a specific story caught her eye. It was written by a flight attendant who had once faced a similar moment of reckoning. The details of their situation were different, but the underlying lesson was clear. The writer described the painful process of confronting their biases, engaging in difficult conversations, and taking responsibility, not as a performance, but as a commitment to real change. One line stood out to Caroline: "Growth isn't easy, but it's necessary. And sometimes, it begins with admitting you were wrong." Caroline leaned back in her chair, staring at the words. The discomfort in her chest refused to fade, but for the first time in weeks, it felt like something more than regret. It felt like resolve. The following morning, Caroline entered Aerolux Corporate Training Center, where she had signed up for an in-person workshop on unconscious bias. She didn't want to hide behind the anonymity of online modules. She needed to face this head-on, in a room full of people with their own stories and struggles. The facilitator, Danielle Torres, was a poised and confident woman whose presence commanded attention without a single raised word. Danielle began the session with a disarming question. "Think about the last assumption you made about someone," she said, pacing slowly across the front of the room. "Not what you said out loud, but what crossed your mind. How did that assumption influence your actions?" Caroline's throat tightened. The image of the Reynolds family flashed into her mind. Ethan standing tall in his tailored suit, Natalie's understated elegance, the children quiet and wide-eyed as they clutched their parents' hands. What had she assumed about them? That they didn't belong. That their first-class tickets were a mistake. That they were out of place. She thought about how she had scanned their tickets twice, her tone clipped and impersonal. How she had relegated them to the back of first class, near the restrooms. How she had avoided looking Natalie in the eye when delivering their meal last, as if ignoring her discomfort could make it disappear. "Now," Danielle continued, her tone softening but still firm, "imagine someone made an assumption about you in that same moment. What would they miss about who you really are?" The words cut through Caroline like a knife. She thought of the Reynolds children, Liam and Sophia, watching the subtle slights unfold with the quiet awareness that only children could have. What had they seen in her? What had she shown them? When the session ended, Caroline lingered as the other participants filtered out. Danielle approached her, holding a folder of materials. "Caroline, right?" she asked, her voice warm but curious. "Yes," Caroline said, standing. I'm here because of an incident with a passenger. It was serious enough that I needed to come here." Danielle's expression softened. "You're not the first," she said simply. "What matters isn't why you're here, but what you're willing to take from it. Did anything today resonate with you?" Caroline hesitated, then nodded. "The part about assumptions," she said quietly. "I've spent years convincing myself that I was treating everyone equally, but I wasn't. I made judgments without realizing it, and they influenced everything I did." Danielle studied her for a long moment. "Acknowledging that is hard," she said. "But awareness is only the first step. What you choose to do with that awareness is what matters." That evening, Caroline sat at her laptop again. This time, she opened Aerolux Internal Employee Forum. After scrolling through threads about inclusivity and customer service, she began drafting her own post. Subject: Moving Forward, Lessons from the Sky. Message: As flight attendants, we pride ourselves on creating exceptional experiences for our passengers. But sometimes we fall short, not because we lack skill, but because we fail to see the full picture of the people we serve. Recently, I had an experience that forced me to confront the assumptions I've carried, assumptions that influence my actions in ways I didn't realize at the time. Acknowledging these mistakes is uncomfortable, but necessary. I'm committed to learning and to helping others in our company do the same. If you've ever felt the same, I encourage you to join me in these conversations. Let's make sure Aerolux is a place where every passenger feels they belong, no matter what. Caroline Walker. Her finger hovered over the post button for a long moment. Then, with a steadying breath, she clicked. The next morning, Caroline woke to an unexpected email from Victor Tran, Aerolux Chief Culture Officer. "Caroline, thank you for your honesty and willingness to engage. Your post reflects the kind of leadership we need to foster at Aerolux. I'd like to discuss how we can build on this momentum. Let me know when you're available to meet." Victor Tran. Leadership? The word startled her. It felt too big, too generous for someone who had failed so profoundly. But as she reread Victor's words, she realized something. Perhaps leadership wasn't about perfection. Perhaps it was about the willingness to grow, and to help others grow along the way. That afternoon, Caroline sat across from Victor in his office. "I think there's an opportunity here," Victor said. "You've seen firsthand where our training falls short. If you're willing, I'd like you to help us design a program to address it." "You want me to help with training?" Caroline asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Victor nodded. "Who better to lead this effort than someone who's lived through it? You have a perspective that can make a real difference." Caroline felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared to feel in weeks: purpose. "I'd be honored," she said quietly. As she left Victor's office, Caroline felt a cautious optimism. The weight of her mistakes wasn't gone, but it felt lighter now. She wasn't just making amends, she was building something new. And for the first time, she believed she could. The bright hum of the Aerolux conference room buzzed in Caroline Walker's ears as she stood before the leadership team. The sleek glass walls seemed to magnify every detail: her posture, her expressions, even the subtle tremor in her hands. Rows of senior managers and department heads sat in attentive silence, their faces betraying a range of emotions: curiosity, skepticism, and cautious approval. At the head of the table sat Victor Tran, his calm but discerning gaze fixed on her. This was more than just a presentation. For Caroline, this was a reckoning, a chance to prove that her past mistakes didn't define her and that she was ready to create meaningful change. With a deep breath, she began. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice steady but soft. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share this initiative with you. It's called Project Horizon, and it's not just a training program. It's a commitment to redefining Aerolux as a leader in inclusivity, empathy, and exceptional service." The screen behind her flickered to life, displaying the project's tagline: "Every passenger, every experience, every time." The words felt simple, yet they held the weight of months of reflection and determination. Caroline clicked through the slides, detailing the program's key components. She explained how Project Horizon was designed to go beyond traditional diversity training. Instead, it focused on cultivating empathy, breaking down unconscious biases, and embedding inclusivity into every touchpoint of the customer experience. "The foundation of this program is built on stories," she said, pausing to meet the eyes of the room. "Stories of passengers, stories of employees, and stories of how small moments can define a person's experience, for better or worse." The screen transitioned to a short video montage of employees sharing their reflections. One flight attendant admitted to hesitating when serving passengers who didn't fit the first-class image. A gate agent described the pride he felt when helping a nervous passenger overcome their fear of flying. Each story was honest, raw, and deeply human. "These stories helped me see that we all carry biases," Caroline continued, her voice gaining strength. "The key is to recognize them, address them, and ensure they don't dictate how we treat others. Empathy isn't just a nice-to-have. It's the foundation of exceptional service. And as an airline, our job isn't just to move people from one place to another. It's to ensure that every person who steps on board feels they belong." When the presentation ended, the room settled into a charged silence. Caroline stood still, her hands clasped in front of her, resisting the urge to fidget. Finally, Victor spoke, his tone thoughtful. "Thank you, Caroline," he said. "You've clearly put a great deal of effort into this." He turned to the room. Comments? A middle-aged man in a tailored suit leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "This is ambitious," he said. "But how do we measure success? A lot of initiatives like this sound good in theory, but don't translate to real change." Caroline nodded, expecting this question. She clicked to the next slide, which outlined accountability metrics in clear detail. "That's why Project Horizon includes measurable benchmarks," she replied. "We'll track passenger satisfaction scores, employee feedback, and incident reports. But metrics alone aren't enough. Success will also come from the culture we create, and that starts with leadership, our leadership." Another woman seated near the back raised her hand. "You've shared some positive stories, but let's be honest. Not everyone will buy into this. What's your plan for addressing resistance? Caroline paused, considering her words. Resistance is inevitable, she admitted. But I believe most of it stems from fear. Fear of being judged, fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of losing control. This program isn't about shaming anyone. It's about creating an environment where people feel safe to grow, to ask questions, and to make mistakes without fear of ridicule. Her response seemed to land well. The woman nodded thoughtfully, and a few other heads around the table followed suit. As the meeting concluded, Victor stood, addressing the room. This initiative has the potential to define Aerolux's future, he said. It won't be easy, but I think we're in capable hands. Caroline, you've shown us what leadership looks like. The words landed with quiet force. Leadership. A term that once felt distant and unattainable now seemed like a possibility, a reality, even. For the first time, Caroline allowed herself to feel pride. This wasn't just about redeeming her past mistakes. It was about building something bigger than herself. Later that week, Caroline found herself back in the sky. It was a standard domestic flight from Atlanta to Denver. Not a glamorous route, but for Caroline, it marked a new beginning. As she moved through the cabin, greeting passengers, she noticed an older man in the last row. He wore a weathered baseball cap and clutched his boarding pass like it was a lifeline. Caroline approached him with a warm smile. "Hi there," she said, crouching slightly to meet his eyes. "Is this your first time flying?" The man nodded, his hands tightening around the armrests. "Yeah. My daughter insisted I visit her, but I don't know. Planes make me nervous." Her smile softened. "Well, I'm here to make sure you're comfortable. If you need anything, water, snacks, even just a chat, press that call button, and I'll be right here." As she walked away, Caroline thought back to the Reynolds family. She remembered Natalie's calm resolve, Ethan's composed demeanor, and the quiet strength of their children. It struck her how easy it had been to dismiss them, to avoid seeing them as individuals with their own fears and stories. She wouldn't make that mistake again. As the plane touched down in Denver, Caroline felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in months. She was still learning, still growing, but she was finally on the right path. Later that evening, as she prepared for bed, her phone buzzed with a text from Victor. "The Reynolds family has requested a meeting with you next week. They've been following your progress and want to hear about Project Horizon directly. Are you ready for this?" Caroline stared at the screen, her heart pounding. The Reynolds family. She had spent months imagining this moment, preparing for it in her mind. Now it was real. With a steadying breath, she typed back, "Yes, I'm ready." Caroline Walker arrived at the Aerolux Executive Lounge earlier than planned, her fingers clutching the smooth edges of a folder containing the final outline of Project Horizon. The terminal's buzz of activity seemed distant, muffled by the weight of her thoughts. Beyond the glass doors, she could see the Reynolds family seated by a window overlooking the runway, the golden glow of the setting sun casting long shadows across the floor. Ethan Reynolds, with his signature composed demeanor, scrolled through his phone while Natalie Reynolds sipped tea, her posture straight but relaxed. Caroline had spent months preparing for this moment, rehearsing words that felt increasingly inadequate the closer she got to delivering them. This wasn't just a meeting. It was her final test, her last chance to prove that the person she had been on that flight no longer existed. Her hand lingered on the door handle, the echo of Natalie's words from their last encounter ringing in her mind. "This isn't about you. It's about what you choose to do moving forward." Caroline took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and stepped inside. The lounge's quiet elegance amplified the sound of her footsteps as she approached their table. Ethan looked up first, offering a polite nod, followed by Natalie, whose gaze was calm but sharp. Neither betrayed anger, but there was an unspoken weight in their presence that made Caroline's chest tighten. "Thank you for meeting with me," Caroline began as she sat across from them, placing her folder neatly on the table. "I know this conversation is long overdue, and I'm grateful for the chance to speak with you." Ethan leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped. "We've been following your progress," he said, his tone neutral but firm. Victor shared the details of Project Horizon. It's ambitious, but ambition alone doesn't guarantee change. Why do you believe this will work? Caroline nodded, expecting the question. She opened the folder and slid a page across the table, a testimonial from an Aerolux flight attendant who had completed the pilot program. Because I've seen it work, she said, her voice steady. This is from one of my colleagues who went through the initial training. She told me it helped her recognize biases she didn't even know she had, and it's already changing how she interacts with passengers. Ethan scanned the document, his expression thoughtful but unreadable. Natalie, however, wasn't looking at the paper. Her eyes remained fixed on Caroline. And you? Natalie asked, her voice softer but no less direct. What have you learned, not just about the passengers you serve, but about yourself? The question landed like a stone, heavy with expectation. For a moment, Caroline's mind flashed back to that flight. Ethan's calm challenge, Natalie's quiet strength, and the silent, watchful eyes of their children, Liam and Sophia. She thought about how her assumptions, so small and fleeting in the moment, had shaped her every action, from dismissive glances to clipped words. I've learned that belonging isn't something you give or take away, Caroline said finally, her voice quieter now but resolute. It's something you create. And I failed to create it for you and your family. But since then, I've made it my mission to ensure that no one else feels the way you did that day. Natalie tilted her head slightly, her gaze softening for the first time. That's a good start, she said. But intentions only go so far. What matters is what you do next. As the conversation continued, Ethan leaned back, his tone reflective. We didn't ask for this meeting to punish you, he said. If that were the case, we wouldn't have supported Victor in keeping you on the team. We're here because we believe in the power of change, but only if it's genuine and sustained. Caroline nodded, her hands resting on the folder. That's what Project Horizon is about. It's not just a program, it's a cultural shift. We're building accountability into every level of the company, from leadership to frontline employees. But I also know that no program can succeed without trust. She paused, her throat tightening. I know I haven't earned yours yet, but I hope over time I can. Ethan and Natalie exchanged a glance, a subtle but significant gesture. Trust isn't built overnight, Ethan said, but you've taken the right steps. We'll be watching to see how this unfolds. Natalie reached for her tea, her expression thoughtful. And Caroline, she said, her tone softening, don't underestimate the impact of small moments. Sometimes, it's the smallest gestures that leave the deepest impression. The meeting ended with handshakes, firm but genuine. As Caroline stepped out of the lounge, the tension in her chest eased, replaced by a cautious optimism. She wasn't sure if she had fully redeemed herself in their eyes, but she knew she had taken an important step. Later that evening, Caroline boarded a flight as a passenger for the first time in years. Settling into her seat, she glanced out the window as the plane taxied down the runway. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, steady and reassuring, as the city lights blurred into streaks of gold. Her mind drifted back to something Danielle Torres had said during her training session. Change doesn't happen in grand gestures. It happens in small, consistent choices. Every day, you decide who you want to be. Caroline smiled faintly. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew this much. Every day, she would choose to be better. Months later, Project Horizon was officially rolled out across Aerolux, garnering praise from employees and passengers alike. Caroline became an unofficial ambassador for the program, sharing her story at workshops and leadership meetings, not as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to the power of accountability and growth. One afternoon, as she prepared to board a flight, Caroline spotted a familiar face in the crowd. Liam Reynolds, now older but still carrying the quiet confidence she remembered, smiled at her as he passed. For a moment, she stood frozen, the full circle of her journey settling over her. Liam's presence wasn't just a reminder of her past. It was a symbol of how far she had come. As the flight attendant called for boarding, Caroline stepped forward, her heart light and her purpose clear. The work wasn't finished. It never would be. But for the first time, she felt certain that she was exactly where she belonged. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey. Caroline's story reminds us that no matter how far we've fallen, redemption is always within reach. It's a testament to the power of humility, growth, and the courage to do better. If this story inspired or moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Be the first to catch our next tale of transformation. Hit subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and join our community of thoughtful storytellers. Your next inspiring moment is just a click away.